In the year 1851, London would see the finished construction of the Crystal Palace, the building that would serve to host the First World's Fair. The Crystal Palace was unlike any other building that anyone had seen up until that point. A marvel of human accomplishments, it highlighted British innovation and reflected the advancements brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Above all else, it was a pillar of hope for many, a promise for a better future. Russian novelist Nikolai Chernyshevsky believed that it instilled confidence in human rationality, that we could continuously improve society until we reached a utopia, symbolized by the Crystal Palace, a place where humans could all live in harmony. Of course, this would never be actualized. Fyodor Dostoevsky explored a much more grounded sentiment through the perspective of the underground man. He realized that the promise of the Crystal Palace was an impossible dream. The irrational nature of humans and our longing to act upon our freedom and desires makes it such. Going even further, proclaiming that the harmony that the Crystal Palace promised would not be desirable even if it were possible. Notes from the Underground was originally published in 1864. Around the same time, the Russian nihilist movement came into prominence. Although Dostoevsky was not a nihilist himself, he understood their desires to irrationally tear down the infrastructure of society. By the 1890s, the Crystal Palace would fall into disrepair, eventually burning down in 1936, with Winston Churchill famously remarking that this is the end of an age. In a similar vein, Paris would enter what would later be referred to as the Beautiful Era, which started around 1880. The Eiffel Tower was constructed in 1889, serving as the grand entrance to the World's Fair, and simultaneously ushering in a time of optimism and stability for France, if you were fortunate enough to afford it. The Beautiful Era saw the development of the Paris Metro, the birth of modern art, and a plethora of other socio-cultural innovations. Of course, much like the Crystal Palace, this, too, would not last. The First and Second World Wars devastated the nation. Although there would be a brief period of elegance between the wars, by 1946, the aftermath was obvious. The city was a far cry from what it was a few decades prior. Paris would undergo repairs, and its cultural life would resume. Christian Dior hosted the first post-war fashion show in 1947, and brought the city back to being the epicenter of high fashion. But, as the city underwent great changes, new problems arose, and many longed for the past. The Algerian War of Independence took its toll throughout the 50s and into the 60s. 1967 saw the release of J.J. Schreiber's The American Challenge, which captivated the nation, convincing many that the only way for Paris to succeed would be for them to adopt the lifestyle of American entrepreneurs, a stark contrast to the traditional way of life seen throughout Paris thus far. May of 1968 was another period of civil unrest for France, prompted by student protests that were fueled by the youth finally unleashing after a lifetime of repression. More than 11 million dissatisfied union workers would eventually join the cause. This social revolution would mark another turning point. Now, with newly founded libertarian ideals, Paris was left in the 1970s contemplating its identity and future. Fashion, in particular, was about to undergo huge changes. Couture would be challenged by the introduction of ready-to-wear. The passing of Christian Dior, Gabrielle Chanel, and Cristobal Balenciaga represented the end of an era. Fashion, and Paris at large, would soon enter a time of liberation marked by youthful desires and decadence. Many longed for a past that they themselves had not actually lived through. Nevertheless, as Paris was reminiscing on its legacy, two young designers had been busy creating legacies of their own. The rivalry of Yves Saint Laurent and Karl Lagerfeld is extensively detailed throughout Alicia Drake's book, The Beautiful Fall, Fashion, Genius, and Glorious Excess in 1970s Paris. It will serve as the main source for which this video is based off of, and I definitely recommend checking it out, as I will not be able to do the entire thing justice. Drake provides a lot of in-depth information, and there are a lot of great sources included at the end. Karl Lagerfeld was born on September 10, 1933 in Hamburg, Germany. 3 years later, in 1936, his future friend turned competitor, Yves Saint Laurent, would be born in Oran, Algeria, a town that had served as a prominent French colony since the 19th century. Although their paths would not cross until later, the two had much in common. Both of them were the only sons from families with hardworking and distant fathers. Both had been regarded as outcasts since their youth, and, of course, both of them desired to one day reach the esteem that could only be found in Paris. Yves had charmed his family from a young age, taking a keen interest in fashion early in his life. At 12 years old, Yves saw the play L'École des Femmes at a local theater, which his mother described as a revelation for him. The theater was all he would talk about. He would would frequently write and direct plays of his own creation. Although he thrived in his home life, school was another story. Yves felt burdened as a result of his physical appearance, combined with the guilt stemming from his homosexuality. Yves stuck out from the others, appearing effeminate in nature. He was often ostracized and turned into a punching bag. Hence, he tended to avoid others, instead folding inwards on himself, rendering him an outcast among his classmates. However, he held on to the fact that one day he would be famous, and his fame would serve as his revenge. He would enter Paris for the first time in 1953 after winning third prize in the International Wool Secretariat competition. Those who he encountered while he was there described him as remarkably shy, yet harboring a strong sense of self-belief. While in Paris, he told his mother that it would not be long until he was working at Christian Dior, which, at the time, was the most prominent couture house. In June of 1954, Yves would enroll at the most renowned couture industry school in Paris. Karl would be enrolled at the same school at the same time, although they were not in the same class. Yves only stayed there for 3 months before entering into a depressive slump. His father remarked that Yves felt as if the school was worth nothing to him, in the sense that he found it too traditional, not stimulating enough for his mind, which was already racing with success. Michel de Brunhoff, the editor-in-chief of French Vogue, who Yves' father had connected him with on his first trip over to Paris, was impressed by Yves' designs, so much so that he brought some of them to show off to Christian Dior. That next year, Yves would take up an assistant role at Dior, and it was here, and under the wing of Mr. Dior himself, that Yves would soon begin to come into his own. Even still, his shyness was overwhelming. A member of the Dior studio described him as a little girl. Yves was someone who never spoke, yet was passive enough to the extent that he could dominate. Across the street, Karl himself would take an internship position under Pierre Balmain. Balmain and Dior, too, had previously worked together, even discussing opening up their own fashion house. This was before Balmain decided to start his solo venture in 1945, with Dior founding his own house a year later. Karl remarked that the treatment they received as the young, new members of their respective houses was akin to that of Yves' school years. Poor conditions, even worse pay, and an overall humiliating atmosphere. However, it was during this time that the pair began to develop a friendship, often confiding in one another. Their group of friends would hang out at Karl's apartment, as one of their friends deemed Karl the only one who had any money at the time. Despite Karl's inherited wealth, he had a certain motivation and discipline unlike any other, which we'll get into later. Around this time, Yves and Karl would befriend a model named Victoire Dortelou, who was working under Christian Dior at the time. Both Yves and Karl frequently competed for her attention, often attempting to win her over through gift-giving and creating her exclusive designs. However, it was Yves who ultimately won her over, for a brief period of time at least, which came after he was promoted and named assistant to Christian Dior in 1957. Another member of their friend group at the time was Anne-Marie Poupard, and the four of them would frequently go out together. Although Yves was shy, and the one who wanted to stay in the most, it was him who often led the group. At this time, Yves was designing around 40 or so dresses for each Dior collection. He would occasionally return home to Oran, where he was met with praise from his family. In the fall of 1957, Christian Dior would attend a spa retreat as an attempt to lose weight and improve his health. This, unfortunately, proved to be futile, as on October 24, 1957, he would suffer a heart attack and pass away at the age of 52. His solo fashion career only lasted 10 years, but its influence is still largely felt to this day. Shortly before his death, Dior met with Yves' mother and he told her that he wished for him to be his successor. A new team was then chosen to head the Dior fashion house, comprised of Raymond Zenecker, Marquette Kerr, Mitza Picard, and 21-year-old Yves Saint Laurent. Yves returned home in December of 1957. And, in a state of euphoria, over the next 3 weeks he would manically create over 1,000 sketches that he would later bring back to Paris. From that, 178 outfits were chosen, and on January 30th, 1958, Yves showed his first collection under Dior. In this collection, he debuted a new silhouette, which was dubbed Trapeze, and many took this as a sign of Yves sort of laying down the law, debuting a more youthful look that Dior had not seen in a long time. Yves made the clothes more free-flowing, giving them spirit by lightening them up and shortening the hemline. His debut was held in high regard, and he was later launched into the limelight. The press viewed him as the new sad child, being tall, thin, narrow-shouldered, melancholic with a skinny face, a sort of faun in the forest. In 1958, Yves would begin a relationship with Pierre Berge, someone who would soon come to play a major role in not just Yves' personal life, but in his career as well. Pierre understood Yves well, and Yves valued the strength that Pierre offered. He was someone he could count on when he was feeling overwhelmed. By 1960, Yves had designed 6 collections for Dior. However, given his age and his experience relative to the others, his time there was not easy. He would often attempt to reclaim power through his work, but this time, that was not enough. Keep in mind, while all of this was going on, so was the Algerian War, and Yves, being aged 24, was eligible for conscription. Dior had previously made it so Yves could avoid having to join the army in the past, but this time was different. As his final collection with Dior was not favorable with Dior's clientele, perhaps this was a way to remove Yves from his position. Yves reported for military training in September of 1960. He did not make it past basic training. After experiencing an immense breakdown, he was hospitalized until mid-November. No one knew if he would ever return to Paris. Yves would recall these memories later, saying that this experience reminded him of the anxieties he felt at school. Going further, stating that they were frequently administering him with powerful tranquilizers, all while keeping him in a room with others who were going mad. It is unknown if this caused Yves to develop a lifelong battle with mental illness, or if this simply awakened pre-existing conditions. However, it is clear that this brief stint would impact Yves for the rest of his life. He was on top of the fashion world one day, and the next he was tossed to the side, exhibiting the unrelenting nature of the industry at large. From now on, Pierre would handle directing Yves' image. He would decide what the public could or could not know about him. Many believe that this was the start of a controlling relationship, but we will soon find out otherwise. When Yves came back on the scene later that year, he would sue Dior for breaching their contract and ultimately win. As a result, in December of 1961, Yves, now with financial backing, would launch the house of Yves Saint Laurent. Although Yves' first collection under his new label did not live up to the heightened expectations of the media, he was celebrated by his close friends and eager to prove himself. At this time, he was still very much influenced by Dior and couture as a whole, but he would soon begin to develop his own identity. Over the next few years, Yves and Pierre's relationship would strengthen, and Yves would begin to come into his own. Yves was praised for being able to continuously deliver the new look and keep things interesting, redefining women's style. During this time, Yves' sister would begin to feel as if something had changed between her and Yves would no longer hang out with Karl. The main factor influencing both of these relationships being Pierre and his seemingly controlling tendencies. By the mid-1960s, Yves' friend group would shrink, becoming very closed off, with heightened importance being placed in his relationship with Pierre and their intimately complex dynamic. Yves and his in-group would begin vacationing in Marrakech, a prominent city in Morocco away from the hustle of Paris. This would mark the beginning of a period of indulgence and hedonism in Yves' life, a stark contrast to his previously uptight, anxious, and strict self. Here he was able to cut loose, away from the pressures of the fashion world. By now, he had launched his ready-to-wear line and was designing 4 collections a year, 2 ready-to-wear, 2 haute couture. Pierre and Yves had also launched their first YSL perfume by now, furthering the label's success and profitability. Yves was enjoying this newfound liberation on his trips away from Paris, often wishing that he wasn't born too early to be a hippie. This period of indulgence, combined with Yves meeting Betty Saint, one of his new fixations and additions to their friend group, would serve as a sort of paradigm shift for Yves. Betty remarked that her introduction encouraged Yves to misbehave a little. He was willing to let go. Of course, while all of this was going on in Morocco, the May 1968 riots were unfolding in France, starting with university students releasing their pent-up anger, transitioning into more than 10 million protesters across the nation. It was clear that times were changing. Although the protests did not usher in an era of promised utopia, they were a sign of things to come and highlighted the notion of liberation, something that Yves had been undergoing in his personal life. Yves would return to Paris that summer and publicly support the protests. As such, his July '68 collection became regarded as his best one yet. While Yves was celebrated on the main stage, Karl Lagerfeld was making moves in silence. Although many in Paris knew his name by 1968, he was often the subject of many rumors which often stemmed from his very calculated appearance. Being born into wealth, it was rare that Karl had such a strong work ethic, and since coming to Paris, he had been doing freelance work for a handful of different designers. He became known for his larger-than-life image, remarked by his characteristics of being extraordinarily physically fit, routinely disciplined, and hard-working. He almost didn't seem real, and was often the subject of laughter as a result. Of course, he did not care. Despite growing up well off, he often experienced similar childhood hardships to Yves, which, too, rendered him an outsider. He lived in exclusion, but had an aura of superiority due to his family heritage. These, too, are traits that he would carry throughout his life. In 1964, Karl met Gabby Aguillon of the brand Chloe. She agreed to hire him as a freelance designer. Karl would soon work his way up to doing over 10 designs per ready-to-wear collection and learned a lot from Gabby. She remarks how prolific Karl was and was impressed by his ability to create designs that sold well. You would think that now, being age 35 in 1968, that Karl would decide to start his own line, but he did not. Despite being a major factor in the success of others and building his own image, he had no real interest in coming up with a distinct Karl Lagerfeld style. However, 1969 would mark an era of change for Karl. Two individuals who came to Paris from the exotic United States of America, named Antonio Lopez and Juan Ramos, would get introduced to Karl and pill him on New York style. Additional arrivals from the US included Donna Jordan and Corey Tippin, who would come to form Karl's entourage. They would immediately become important to Karl and serve as a source of inspiration for him, with Karl often referring to himself as vampiric in the sense that he would utilize others for his own gain. With Karl's entourage now established, in the 1970s he would continue to improve upon his relationships with those close to him. His entourage served as a mutually beneficial experience. Karl would fund their lifestyles, while they would serve as a means of inspiration for him. The Americans found that Karl lived up to his larger-than-life image, often to a ridiculous extent. Again, almost to a fault, with Karl often being the butt of the joke. Karl exhibited great generosity to those around him, and began taking his entourage on trips to spend their summers in Saint-Tropez. Dissimilar to Yves, Karl would remain disciplined during his vacations, often highly cautious of his physical appearance, and not engaging in the same levels of indulgence. Karl must have known that, being older, he didn't entirely fit in. He was content with just sitting back and watching the others have fun, studying those around him and benefiting from their presence. It was his entourage who influenced Karl's new philosophy regarding fashion. No longer would it be about hemlines or creating the new look, but more so a collection themed around a certain attitude, a trend that we still see to this day. At the time, Karl's habits may have appeared unorthodox, but little did they know how ahead of the time he was, and how many things he predated. Of course, with Karl committing to his own entourage, and as such, furthering his commitment to the fashion industry, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before he began to clash with Yves. Yves' group was regarded as the most exclusive, letting few people in, with the odd exception. One exception was made for Lulu de la Falaise, someone who would soon become a great source of inspiration for Yves. Yves invited her to Marrakech, where she immediately had a huge effect on Yves. While others walked on eggshells around him, she was fearless and encouraged him to be less self-conscious, further contributing to the newly found liberation that he was experiencing. At the same time, Andy Warhol arrived in Paris and would join Karl's group. Again, furthering the American influence that Paris was indulging in at the time, and cementing Karl as a force to be reckoned with. This moment reflected the overall changes that Paris was going through, the protest, American attitudes, the tongue-in-cheek youthful nature, all of which was a stark contrast to the traditional sense of haute couture. It was clear that a new age was underway. With both groups coming into their own and their rivalries gaining prominence, their clash was inevitable. It was an intense and exciting time, fueled by newly found liberation, indulgence, desires, and the ability to act and design without constraints. Beyond fashion, the 70s were a time of sexual freedom for the homosexuals, with Le Sept being a major staple for indulgence. It was a place for all attractive people, regardless of background or sexual orientation, to experience this newly found freedom. Karl and Yves' group would frequently attend it, and it became the new hotspot for people to converge. This year, Yves would reference the boxy, wide features of the clothes of the 1940s, which led to the debut of the Saint Laurent shoulder motif featured on jackets that Yves would become known for. Additionally, this was the same time Kenzo came on the scene, and became the closest thing to competition that Yves had had in years. 1972 was a time of turmoil for the Karl group. Karl, through elevating his business relationships with Antonio and Juan, had been letting their friendship slide. As previously mentioned, due to his otherworldly characteristics, Karl was often the subject of many impersonations and frequently the butt of the joke. Of course, he often let that slide, as he greatly benefited from having the likes of Antonio and Juan around. They kept him busy and full of new ideas. Karl would basically achieve success through observing, referencing, and recreating, all while reinventing himself in order to stay relevant. Of course, this would soon be to the detriment of his friends. In their summer retreat to Saint-Tropez, Karl brought a new friend along named Jacques de Bachir. Jacques was everything that Karl's American friends were not. He was French and from a privileged life, unfamiliar with the world of fashion. The Americans knew that their time was up, with Corey understanding the disposable nature of fashion and Karl's tendency to find new fixations. Tensions continued to grow within the group, eventually exploding when, one night, Juan and his boyfriend Paul threw the chair that Karl's mother used into their pool. The next morning, Karl kicked them out, and this was likely around the same time that he realized he had gotten everything he could out of the American group. As such, Karl and Jacques continued to grow in their relationship. with Karl now finding new sources of inspiration. At the same time, in November of 1972, Yves would take a trip to New York City, where he was welcomed and hailed as a fashion messiah. Many of the people around Yves only existed to please him. Thus, combined with his heightened status, continued to fuel his narcissistic tendencies. Many regarded him as existing within his own world, and with Pierre handling the logistics, Yves was free to immerse himself in whatever endeavors he pleased. Around this time, ready-to-wear was booming and couture was falling off. In 1973, Yves outsourced the manufacturing aspect of Saint Laurent's ready-to-wear collections while he maintained control over designing. Around this time, global retail sales were around $24 million a year for the ready-to-wear line alone. With Pierre now in a more prominent position of power, many began to take note of his controlling tendencies. While Pierre ordered everyone around, Yves often sat in silence in his studio. Of course, Pierre was the only one who really knew the real Yves and his manic depressive nature. From an outside perspective, Pierre seemed controlling and restrictive, when, in reality, he was only trying to negate Yves' tantrums and hide the side of him from the press. He needed to keep Yves stimulated, all while handling the business side of things, and controlling Yves' aggression. Yves was often depicted as the tortured artist archetype, and although many can theorize if this is self-imposed and as a result of his destructive tendencies, we will never really know for certain, but we can gain a glimpse into his mind through the cartoons that he illustrated, which were entitled La Villaine Loulou, which follows a self-obsessed sadist protagonist with psychopathic tendencies. The illustrations echoed the melancholic aura that Yves so often carried. Karl's fascination with Jacques continued to grow well into 1973. Karl often praised him, and it was clear that this was his new source of inspiration. He allowed Karl to tap into what he was not. Karl, being around 40 years old at this point, was enthralled by Jacques' youthfulness and flamboyant nature. Of course, that is not all. Jacques, being an interesting, extravagant individual, was sure to catch the attention of Yves. It was only a matter of time. With Karl and Yves both now in the spotlight, both designing ready-to-wear and both frequenting the same locations, surely some drama would eventually arise. But for now, Karl continued to work his way up at Chloe, becoming a pivotal figure in the ready-to-wear department. He frequently stayed ahead of the game and kept designing collections that sold really well. All the while, despite his attention and outwardly successful appearance, he still felt alone. He did not engage in the same level of indulgence as those around him. He maintained his discipline and insisted that it was impossible for him to love anything other than his job. As such, Karl succeeded where others failed. For instance, Karl's entourage continued to fall apart. Corey, who was once a prominent source of inspiration for Karl on account of his exotic American appeal and youthful nature, was now the old age of 24 and washed up. Karl provided Corey with anything he could have wanted, and he was a part of the in crowd. But when you are no longer needed, fashion can be quite cruel, casting you aside when you have no more to offer. That was Corey's fate. With no job or skills, once his beauty was gone, he was no longer needed, eventually resulting in him returning home to New York. But that is not all. The later half of 1973 saw the Karl and Yves rivalry take a turn for the worse. An affair would break out between Yves and Jacques. It was here that Yves would display the extent to which he would go to satisfy his desires, showcasing his obsessive nature. The affair ended after a long night of Yves pursuing Jacques at Lessept, ultimately culminating in Yves crashing his Volkswagen Beetle into a pole next to where Jacques was standing. Yves then called Pierre to pick him up, thus ending his fascination with Jacques just like that, highlighting how quickly Yves can transition from burning passion to unrelenting boredom. Perhaps this affair was motivated by the thrill of taking something from Karl, and, in turn, cemented the power that Jacques wielded. Upon hearing the news, Karl threw himself into a temper, with Pierre blaming Karl for being unable to control his man. Such is life. Karl would resent Jacques for some time, while Pierre continued to vouch for Yves and clean up his mess. In 1975, at 41 years old, Karl signed a lucrative perfume deal with Chloe, which was when the real money started rolling in for him. This was the first time he began receiving some of the profit share as opposed to just doing freelance work. Karl brought Jacques and Jose along with him to the USA to champion his new deal. After the three returned to Paris, they regrouped with the rest of Karl's entourage and left on another vacation in August of 1975, where tragedy soon struck. On the morning of August 26, 1975, Jose was found dead on a set of train tracks approximately a 20-minute drive away from where they were all staying. There are many uncertainties surrounding his death, but the cause appeared to be suicide. Jacques was devastated, as Jose was someone who he was really close with. However, only 3 days later, Karl was back to work. When Pierre heard the news, he used it to push the agenda that Karl's entourage was dangerous, blaming Jacques for being flirtatious and evil with the capacity to drive people mad, basing this off of Yves' prior obsession with him. The same year, Yves' mental state continued to decline, and his obsessive tendencies became very clear. His work often reflected his life. He doesn't see any restrictions, which renders him prone to overindulging. However, many speculated that this is where his genius came from, that his obsessive nature and being this self-imposed, tortured artist was the key to his success. Of course, this could not be sustainable. Many speculated that he grew to need Pierre to handle things for him in order to function. This would be tested in 1976, which saw Pierre move out of their shared apartment after 18 years of being together. This decision marked a change in Pierre's life. He was now interested in self-preservation, but he still highly valued his role in the Saint Laurent destiny. He viewed himself and Yves as an eagle with two heads. Yves still greatly needed Pierre, which can be highlighted by the fact that one day, while Pierre was in New York having lunch, Yves called him in a panic, asking him how to find a plumber to fix a leak in his apartment. As Yves' condition worsened, the brand only became more and more successful. Yves announced his depression in December of 1976, but this didn't seem to hinder his work ethic. He proclaimed that he had been exploding with new ideas for months now, and taking new risks. Like, for instance, he was utilizing far more color in his sketches and his subsequent designs for the season. He would frequently be held up in his bedroom, chain-smoking cigarettes, pouring his heart into his work. He stated that his clothes incorporated all of his dreams. As such, when he finally finished working, he felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness, leading to a mental breakdown and Pierre checking him into the American hospital, where he was treated for severe depression. Yves then returned to Marrakech in August, and rumors of his death began to spread. He was drinking 2 liters of whiskey a day and experiencing a mental collapse that he would never entirely recover from. He was hospitalized again, almost until the debut of his ready-to-wear collection in October. The collection, known as the Carmen Collection, saw the debut of 281 outfits, with the show lasting over 2.5 hours. It featured encore after encore, with Yves describing it as a personal explosion. Although he was suffering, he was in love with his work. And, just like that, after the show, there was a car waiting to take him back to the hospital. The means by which Yves utilized his self-destruction for creativity was as clear as ever. Although Karl did not have the same self-destructive tendencies to the extent that Yves frequently experienced, he was hypercritical of his physical appearance for some time, and, of course, he had his own vices. As previously mentioned, he was keen on hitting the gym and staying in shape, but around the start of the 1970s, he began to lose interest in going to the gym. He began to put on weight and frequently drank multiple bottles of Coca-Cola a day. He would later get back to working out and attempt to regain control over his weight, but it wasn't until his 60s that he finally achieved a healthier physique. This was perhaps as a result of his work ethic at the time, combined with the fact that he wasn't doing drugs, drinking, or smoking like everyone else around him. He was very keen to continuously reinvent himself and then impose that perfected version of himself onto the world. The mid-70s saw Karl adopt his mafia look, where he frequently wore less form-fitting cuts in favor of more free-flowing silhouettes, including yogi suits. Karl often distinguished himself from Yves through his interactions with the media, Yves, of course, being far more reclusive at this time, with his appearances being dictated by Pierre, while Karl, on the other hand, made for great entertainment. He was very generous, never overtly boastful, and used the media to tell his story. His seductive nature and intelligence made for good press, and were often the key to his success in the realm of fashion. Although his designs did not have a one distinct Karl Lagerfeld style, the same way there was a Saint Laurent uniform, Karl continuously reinvented himself, reflecting the sentiments felt at the time. Karl was often not concerned with the past and what he had done. He was always focused on what he will do. In the later half of the 70s and into the 80s, Jacques threw many parties for Karl with the intent of cementing the Karl Lagerfeld image. They also served as a way for Karl to observe those around him and continue his vampiric tendencies, which now, with punk being on the rise in Paris in 1977, a great sentiment of youthful disdain for the hippie generation was now present. Much of the younger generation now felt a strong rejection for the student freedom fighters just 10 years prior. The threat of socialism in France was also on the rise at the time, but that did not stop Yves from securing a bag with the debut of the new YSL Opium fragrance, which launched in Europe in October of 1977, and later on in the US. Throughout this time, however, Yves' presence continued to become increasingly rare, in stark contrast to Karl, who often went out of his way to engage with the media. The two groups would enter a very brief ceasefire with one another during the wedding of Paloma Picasso. The wedding saw Pierre and Karl speaking calmly to one another, and Yves and Karl complimenting each other, which was very rare. Of course, this would not last, and proved to be the calm before the storm. 1978 was a pivotal year for Karl, which saw the unfortunate passing of his mother 3 days after his 45th birthday. Karl understandably had an immense fear of illness and death being the one thing in his life that he could not control. He began a period of angst, which was not good for his tendency to binge eat. Additionally, this was around the time he started to develop a reputation for venting his jealousy in public, starting with taking shots at Yves and haute couture, eventually leading to him being referred to by the press as Catty Karl. At this time, Yves, being 42 years old, still had intense habits of excess and self-destruction, often excessively smoking 120 cigarettes a day. Although his all-or-nothing attitude was a major factor in his success, it was, of course, the reason for his downfall. However, at this time, many regarded YSL as a sort of religion. Yves had an authoritative, seductive nature that inherently commanded those around him. Many experienced sharing his overwhelming feelings of anxiety, stress, and joy. Those around him worked simply to serve him and frequently attempted to live up to his standards. Of course, Yves was still very much checked out of reality. He needed the likes of Pierre to look after him, and only years after the fact did people understand this. Yves did not want to look after himself. He created their situation, and not Pierre, like many speculated. Although Yves was often viewed as the innocent, tortured spirit, innocent angel, he did actually possess a great strength. Few people were able to see the violence that Yves actually created. Yet, he needed his ivory tower and support from Pierre. Pierre spoke on the relationship dynamic in 2005, addressing that it was actually quite the opposite of what everyone had expected. Pierre existed as a self-imposed prisoner. He understood his role, and yet he wanted to be there for Yves. As such, with Yves pulling the reins and Pierre in his position of power led to a clash between Pierre and Karl. Pierre, of course, liked to exercise his control, but Karl was someone who could not be controlled. Karl was one of the few people who would stand up to Pierre, but of course, that only fueled the creative, obsessive, work-oriented passion that Yves and Karl exhibited. From 1978 and on, Yves would begin a period of refinement. He would begin to step further and further away from fashion and ready-to-wear, now focusing on haute couture again. He understood that, at his age, and given the state of repetition that fashion was in, Yves could only refine the pure YSL style, which began with a series of homage collections. At this time, Yves was personally profiting around $4 million or so a year, with Karl making around $3.5 million. But while all of this was going on, the first socialist president took power in May of 1981, a dark day for France's millionaires. It was not all doom and gloom for the fashion world, however. 1982 saw the likes of Comme des Garçons and Yohji really arrive on the scene in Paris and come into their own. Yet, around this time, Karl was experiencing more existential angst. One of his biggest fears was being left behind, or not being a part of the moment. He did not let that fear stop him, because at 49 years old, on September 15th of 1982, Karl accepted a position to design for Chanel. Finally, he had caught up to Yves all these years later. Chanel would bring Karl the excess wealth and fame that he would become known for. Of course, this would also be the most stressful position for him. Many in Paris were not keen on Chanel's decision, Yves included. Karl knew how much Chanel meant to Yves, with Karl later stating, "Poor Yves did not need to go to Chanel to make Chanel-style clothing. He's been making Chanels and selling them as Saint Laurents for years." Ultimately, Karl's first collection for Chanel fell short for many. He chose to reference the brand's work in the 1920s and 30s, which failed to ignite the audience. Some regarded the collection as feeling incomplete, as Karl failed to get the Chanel armhole right, which was something the brand consistently had been known for doing well. Yet, Karl did not let this negative reception consume him. Karl knew the world of fashion had changed. He knew the success that ready-to-wear could have, and most importantly, he knew the power of not only creating an image, but marketing it. Unbeknownst to him at the time, Karl would lay the blueprint for many future designers and creative directors to come. He began to combine elements of Chanel's iconography, all while tapping into the unfolding zeitgeist at the time. Karl set the precedent for this new sense of a postmodern designer. Karl's fangs were out, and his vampiric instincts were thriving. Now having unlimited access to the Chanel archives, he could reference and reinvent as much as he desired. He was able to develop Chanel's identity and take the house into the modern era. At 50 years old in 1983, Karl was now designing ready-to-wear for Chanel as well as for his own line, which was shown off in Paris twice a year. The more he worked, the more energy he seemed to have. He continued to surround himself with like-minded individuals who fueled his passion. Around this time, Karl had cut ties with Chloe after some drama unfolded where he accused them of tampering with his designs. Yet, as Karl was still bossing up, those around him began to feel the aftermath of their years of excess. Jacques fell ill in the 80s, and it was revealed that he had AIDS. Of course, at the time, there was much uncertainty surrounding the illness, often remarked as an unexplained immune deficiency syndrome, yet it began plaguing the gay community. Many who frequently indulged in the Paris nightlife around this time were impacted. AIDS was one of the major contributors to the end of this time of glamour and excess. The drugs, the sex, the mindless hedonistic acts all had to come to an end at some point. Their once youthful spirits had been crushed. Yves continued to feel the weight of this self-destruction as well, and in 1985, he entered an alcohol-induced coma for a brief period of time. When Yves did appear in public, it was clear that he was a changed man. His workflow was slowing down. As such, Pierre began transitioning Yves' image, now championing him for museum exhibits and heralding every show as an anniversary of sorts. Pierre also continued to try focusing on his own career now. Yet, all these years later, Yves' affair with Jacques was still a major source of jealousy for Karl. Although Karl gave an interview where he spoke on his supposed friendship with Yves, you could tell that he still held great resentment. Yves was something that Karl could never be. Pierre went on to state that Yves was just a poor boy with a psychological disorder, while Karl is just a German designer who wants to be a Saint Laurent, and that Karl should seek a psychiatrist for help. Yves was highly emotional. He was driven by desire, fueled by indulgence, always seeking out the next thing or the next person to inspire him. He had high highs and low lows, all of which motivated him creatively. Karl, on the other hand, was all business. He was driven by productivity. He didn't let himself go the same way that Yves did. In a similar vein, he would use others for inspiration and then cut them off, and he was never satisfied as well. Once Karl was finished with his work, the pleasure was gone. He was always eager to get on to the next thing. Karl described himself as a nymphomaniac who never got to finish. Perhaps Karl's past is a major point of contention for him. He often changed his story when referring back to his home life, which may come as a result of some repressed memories. He likely felt a lot of guilt growing up and was unable to really tap into his past as a result. Regardless, he continued to attack Yves in the media, claiming that all of his designs looked the same, yet he continued to detest his rivalry, stating that he would just rather focus on the future. Of course, this only worsened his reputation. Maybe the fact that Karl knew the real Yves before his success had an impact on his view. He saw through the tortured artist persona that the masses knew. He knew that Yves' image had been romanticized by the press. If it wasn't apparent that times were changing and that this era of decadence was coming to an end, 1989 would really drive home this sentiment. By May of this year, Jacques' condition had taken its toll, and after a long stay at the hospital, and with Karl frequently by his side, Jacques would pass away in September at the young age of 38 years old. Despite their ups and downs, Jacques and Karl had an immense bond that only they really understood. Jacques represented an ideal for Karl. Karl later explained that Jacques was everything that Karl could not be. Karl lived vicariously through him. While Karl was disciplined and content with just watching, Jacques was free to indulge and live out however he wanted. He was one of the few people who could understand Karl's motivations, admitting at the start of 1980s that Karl would much prefer chocolate cake and Coca-Cola to love. Karl admitted too that at the age of 14, he realized that he was born to be alone, stating, "I live on a set with the curtains closed and with no audience, but who cares?" Karl was someone who had always needed more. As such, he was unsure how to love. He could not relate to others, and he had always felt like an outsider, even while in the company of those who admired him. Yves' father would also pass away in the late 80s, and as such, Yves fell ill again and began drinking heavily at the start of the 90s. After some more stays at the hospital, it was clear that Yves' party days were long gone. He soon spoke openly of his illness and proclaimed how his depression had changed him, yet his strength and willpower had always shown through his work. When people criticized him and begged him to change up, he persisted, and his conviction to perfect the YSL look was unmatched. Despite his hardships, he was more self-righteous than ever, stating to the media that he was the last couturier, a stark contrast to the sentiments he exhibited in the late 60s, professing the future of ready-to-wear. Unlike Christian Dior, Yves would not personally name a successor. He truly believed that YSL and couture would die with him. Yves would go on to criticize Karl and Chanel, stating that couture was regressing. At Chanel, they put chains and leather straps everywhere, he said. That poor woman must be rotting in her grave. Yves gave up designing ready-to-wear in 1998 at the age of 62, and YSL was sold that following year, although Yves maintained designing their couture collections. However, around this time, Tom Ford would join YSL and started to be revered as a new idol. Tom Ford had proven himself through his work with Gucci in the 90s, and was eager to revisit the work of Yves and YSL collections from the 70s. Yves, of course, disliked Ford's interpretation of his work, stating, "He does what he can, that poor boy." Faced with reality, Yves retired at the start of 2002. He announced his retirement, paid tribute to those who had supported him, and spoke openly about his depression. Yves' reign was officially over. Karl's personal brand would suffer great financial losses and go under in 1997, but he continued his work with Chanel and collaborated with a variety of other brands and designers. Many believe that Karl needed Chanel. It was curious how he could always do so well designing for others, but never really focused on his own brand or creating a distinct Karl Lagerfeld style, again reflecting his desires to frequently move on to the new latest and greatest thing. Karl would become friends with Hedi Slimane in 2001, who, at the time, was the menswear designer for Dior, although he did initially begin his career at YSL in 1997. Karl remarked just how much Hedi reminded him of a young Yves Saint Laurent, not just in physical appearance, but his introverted nature contrasted by his strong conviction. Yves would pass away in 2008, but his legacy has continued to live on, through the Pierre Berge and Yves Saint Laurent Foundation preserving his work, and through the next generation of designers still frequently referencing his work to this day. Karl would continue to live out his life, working and enjoying his fame. His work ethic never waned, and he finally became the star that he always wanted to be. Karl would too later pass on in 2019, but of course, much like Yves, he will always be remembered through his work and the everlasting influence that he has had. If you'll recall, I began this video by discussing the Crystal Palace and the notion of utopia and the impossible dream that it represented, and our irrational desires to act in stark contrast to the harmony that utopia offers. Utopia, of course, means many different things for many different people, yet the one common desire that we all share is freedom. Freedom to indulge, the freedom to smoke 120 cigarettes a day, the freedom to drink 20 bottles of Coke a day. When that freedom is infringed upon, is utopia really desirable? It is clear that fashion goes hand in hand with indulgence. It is fueled by desire, passion, and irrationality. Fashion is never content. It is always about finding the new thing. We have learned what it must have been like to be wanted one day and then thrown aside the next. It happened to Yves when he was dropped by Dior, and it happened to Corey when he was no longer an object of fascination. Yves and Karl survived as a result of their extraordinary capabilities. Yves obsessed with his creativity and driven by emotions, Karl obsessed with his work ethic and fear of being left behind. Neither of them would have been as successful as they were if they maintained a completely rational lifestyle. The notion of the tortured artist would not exist in utopia. Yves and Karl alike knew the ups and downs associated with both their work and personal lives. Yves especially had to know that he could not go on living that way forever. Those around Yves and Karl who frequently partook in the rampant hedonism throughout the 70s were soon met with the harsh aftermath of it all. They understood the risks, yet indulged anyway. Perhaps that is the human spirit. Many would rather exercise their freedom to indulge than give it all up for a rational, unremarkable existence. Again, the vast majority of information in this video came from Alicia Drake's book, The Beautiful Fall, Fashion, Genius, and Glorious Excess in 1970s Paris. I highly recommend checking it out as it features far more depth compared to the summary that I've presented today. Thank you for watching.